Um, this session is Being Jewish Today, and we're very pleased to have a wonderful panel: Rabbi Steven Fox, Rabbi Julie Schwartz, Rabbi Jen Lader, and Rabbi Sam Joseph. Here is the plan for the morning as I envisage it. I'm going to ask each of the four panelists to speak from 2 to 4 minutes, essentially summarizing and perhaps expanding a bit on the statements that they made, and which I hope all of you have seen or heard. Then I'm going to ask follow-up questions to each of them. Then we'll engage in some discussion together. And at some point, I will begin to ask the questions that you have asked us. I have some of the questions that have been prepared in advance. There are cards available, maybe you got them coming in, on which you can write your questions. I encourage you to make the questions brief. If they contain a great deal of prologue, I'm going to just put the question at the bottom of my pile. So try to make them as brief and concise as possible, and they will be coming to me along the way. Okay, well, I want to turn to each of our panelists now and ask them to give preliminary remarks. So I'm going to turn first to Rabbi Fox.
So often we call what you just described A&A instead of Q&A, answer and answer. So for my opening remarks, I'm going to assume you've read all of our essays. I'm sure it's a safe assumption. And pick up on the themes and just expand a little and put some context to what I hope is this morning's discussion in a broader sense. My theme was innovation anchored in Jewish tradition, which I believe is at the center of Jewish life. The challenge today is, how do we have the courage to be creative, the courage to innovate, and the capacity to anchor that in our tradition? In order to have that courage, we have to recognize the inherent tension in those two poles. Innovate, innovate, innovate. Try something new, but make it Jewish. Okay. I will say that, and the part that wasn't in what I wrote is, that's Jewish history. I'm going to paint a quick picture of Jewish history in 2 minutes or less. We just celebrated Pesach. We left Egypt and had to create some kind of new religion in the desert. And we did it. We left the desert and we had to create some kind of new religion in the land that we were aiming for 40 years, and we did it. Eventually building the temple and building a religion around the temple cult, even though we all know most of the people at the time didn't live in Jerusalem at the temple, but we created a religion around that. The most transformative religious experience that happened, creativity, for us, was after the destruction of the temple with the creation of Rabbinic Judaism, which in many ways has guided Jewish life until today. That's when we gave birth to what really is known as the synagogue today. Think about that innovation. You went somewhere and you sacrificed, and next thing you're in a temple, in a synagogue. Passing through Jewish history, one of those, at Disneyland, what was it, where you go over America in 30 seconds? Passing through Jewish history very quickly, we ended up in Spain, and I'll tell you on a personal note, my family left Spain in the 1490s. So we call ourselves German Jews, but we were in Spain until the 1490s. And then all of us went to Germany, Eastern Europe, and those places. And again, innovated. Much of the Rabbinic Judaism that added the spiritual element we're learning about today and spiritual practices, Hasidic literature, emerged then from Eastern Europe. And in the Western side, my family ended up in Germany. In the 1840s, they sat men and women together in this new thing called Reform Judaism. So innovation anchored in this in tradition. So think of Cleveland. Think of it here. So we end up in America, 15,000 of us. When this temple was formed, we had grown from 15,000 to 15,000 Jews in North America. And all the things we saw in the video last night that were innovation. Men and women were both involved in the early Reform movement here. That was innovation. Men and women sat together. We brought in organs and music coming from Europe to here. New kinds of prayers with English. We went from 50,000 Jews in the year you were opened here. 2.5 million Jews joined us in the next few years. Think of that. So we had to change. We had issues of immigration. So what were some of the major innovations that I would paint quickly for you? I would do it by individuals who you know the names of. Wise wanted to reform Judaism. That was Isaac Mayer Wise's goal. The things you know about. The music, the English. And more importantly, his goal was to create an American rabbinate, what he called American boys. American men and women, and eventually the American Jewish communities led by HUC's graduates, whether it's rabbinic, cantorial, educational. But that's what he wanted. He wanted to reform what we did. Then between the two wars, we had somebody who wanted to reconstruct Judaism. His name was Mordecai Kaplan. And he saw reconstructing Judaism as synagogue-based, yeah, but community center-based. And that was the emerge of a new kind of Judaism, a shul with a pool. I guess you don't have that here because you have winter. In California, we have the shul with the pool, where I grew up. But you think about that, okay? What do we want to do today? Today we want to renew Judaism. Renewal. Renewal, where does it go? Much of the renewal practices go back to that Hasidic experience. Meditation. Spiritual experience. Prayer is talking to God. Meditating is experiencing God. That's not new, but we're renewing Judaism. And amidst of all this, what are our challenges? And then I'll just sort of set this context. I'll say the challenges are the same as 1850. Sorry to put it that way to all the younger folk who say everything's new. Technology. You were struggling in the 1850s with the railroad and the telegraph and things like that, getting people all the way out to Cleveland. Demographic shifts. 2.5 million people moved to this country who were Jewish. Okay, that's huge. And other things like that we faced all along. But what are we going to hear this morning? We're going to hear from all of us, because all of us wrote about it in the conversation, that our pillars and the foundations haven't changed. Our adherence to values, to identifying with the oppressed, the stranger, the immigrant, equality in our society, the importance of a day of rest, Shabbat, and importantly for you here, with a new rabbi, the importance of community. Those values are the things that transcend time in Jewish life.
Thanks very much, Rabbi Fox. I'm going to turn it now to Rabbi Schwartz.
Well, I need to clarify my use of technology here. I just got a text from my daughter telling me to put my phone away. I was using the technology, just to clarify, to take notes on, because I would prefer to put it right there and hold on to it. But that already is a problem, right? I spent time in my congregation in Atlanta telling kids to put their phones away during services. Now I'd have to say they were taking notes during my sermon. I think that would be a different kind of illusion. The question I struggle with is with Jewish identity and the need to find a way to be authentically Jewish and yet recognize that none of us own that. There's no automatic. We have people who meet all of the criteria for being called a Jew, and yet if you looked at them and who they were and how they lived, I would be loath to call them Jewish. And then there are people who join our community or who live within our communities and haven't gone through the official steps or don't know things the way that you should know them, whatever that means. You should know this about Judaism or that about Judaism. And yet they are truly, from my perspective, the roots, the center, the core of what I would consider to be the best of Judaism. And yet at the same time, between those two extremes is the reality that we have to find a way to know how to recognize each other. We have to have something that feels like real. And yet, as soon as you set that boundary, you say, this is what makes you a real Jew, or this is what you have to do to become Jewish, you have put somebody on the outside, and it may be very appropriate, but you also may have put somebody on the inside, and it's not so appropriate. Or vice versa, of course. We've lost someone who really should be welcomed into the Jewish community and valued thoroughly. It is an argument, a debate that can't be won. And I have found myself as a rabbi, ordained since '86, going back and forth. I knew all the answers at ordination. I was very clear about what the rules were and how you had to follow them. And I've gone back and forth. I've said there should be no rules. Well, I don't believe there should be no rules, but I do believe that the rules need to be fluid. I'm much more concerned about the boundaries that we trespass in terms of our relationships with one another and treating one another with respect and as holy creatures than I am about the boundaries and the rules about who's a Jew. But there've got to be some rules and boundaries somewhere. And if you know them, tell me. I'll write them down on my phone.
Thank you so much. I want to turn it now over to Rabbi Lader.
Thank you. So in my house, we call the phone the magical answer box. So like at dinner, you'll say, my 5-year-old son will say something like, well, how long is the most someone's ever held their breath? And we'll like take out our phone and Google. He'll say, can you Google it for me? And so we'll Google it, we'll figure it out. And so it's crazy to me that Jews have spent our whole peoplehood trying to find answers, studying and learning and passing down information from person to person. And yet now we have this tool in our hand to take notes on, to play with during services when the rabbi's sermon is truly spectacular. It's nothing to do with the sermon. But that we have these answers in our hands, and yet we expect our children, who are digital natives, to care about what we have to say. And so my rabbinate has been about that search for relevancy for the next generation. And I know that I'm here because of what my community did for me when I was a kid, which was to teach me what it meant to be in relationship with other people. You know, kids want to be part of a movement. They want to be part of something greater than themselves. That's why they love soccer. That's why they care about social justice issues, because they want to feel like they have a role in the world. But being on a phone is very, very different than sitting with a human being, and we all know that. That's why we're here. That's why we're members of a congregation and members of a sacred community, because we know what that means. And so in order for us to teach what that means, we have to model it. And so our kids are looking for authenticity. They need leaders who care deeply about them, and not just leaders. They need to know that their community stands behind them, that they're supported, that they're funded, that they're given the right opportunities. And they also need to see that being Jewish, being part of that greater something, is valuable to them in this world today, that it's not just about learning something because your grandparents learned it, or reading from a text and not knowing what it means, but it's about having people in their lives who care deeply about their well-being, who love them unconditionally no matter what, who support them, and who are proud to share their legacy with them, and can say to these children, to these teens, to these young adults, to all adults, you are a strong link in our chain of tradition, and we are so, so proud to have you. And so that's, for me, what being Jewish means. It's creating those strong links by being authentic and being intimate and being caring and being loving no matter what.
Thank you so much. Rabbi Joseph?
So I'll take a risk in an example of how I want to frame my words. I didn't know where Rabbi Cohen was going last night when he started with the First Crusade in 1096. I'm thinking, you know, he was terrific where he wound up, but I'm going to take that same risk. I look at where we are today as it's around the year 70 of the Common Era, and the temple has been destroyed, and we're all at Yavna trying to understand what it means to be Jewish when there's no more temple. And I don't mean that I'm not a person who believes in the oy vey type of Judaism. You know, it's constantly oy vey. I actually, in my essay that you can read, lifted up the idea that our mission in the main is to teach hope. I think if I say, why does the world need Jews after all these thousands of years, is because I think we are the model of hope. I think our work as Jews is to defeat despair. And I think that, so with that as sort of the frame, I'll mention two other areas besides the mission of hope and defeating despair. One is thinking about what does it actually mean to live a Jewish life today. We could talk about this for hours, but I will say a few things. I think our work is to constantly be reinforcing that we like and enjoy being Jewish, that it's a good way to live, and we internalize that. I think we don't subscribe to the idea, schwer zu ein Yid, that it's difficult to be Jewish, but that we're Jewish, it's our Jewish identity in all situations. We're not a Jew at home and not a Jew out on the street. I think that requires us to try to be as literate as possible as Jews. I want to be with Jews and say, look at my watch on Friday afternoon and say, listen, we got to go because Shabbat's coming in, and I don't have people turn and see if the door's opening. I think that what it means to live a Jewish life includes that we are critical of the Jewish community, but loyally critical, because we're all trying to move to the same ends. And one other thing just in that area, which is I think all of us should be committed as Jews to solving the problems of the Jewish world immediately. So that's sort of a few things to think about in Jewish life. And the other is in thinking about being Jewish today is the role of institutions. There's the question, of course, is Jewish institution affiliation something that's vital? And the pressures on what's called the legacy institutions, which, by the way, I don't like the term. I think it's a pejorative to start with, that there's a legacy and then the better or the non-legacy, the startups. I think the answer in general about institutions is yes, and certainly is affiliation vital, the answer is yes. But clearly, the definition of what is a Jewish institution has changed a lot. There are many more informal ways that people are doing Jewish life and institutionalizing that. There are technology, certainly, that's been named a number of times. I think it's much more a blessing than a curse of what that allows for. In summary, it's hope and not despair. It's living a Jewish life that we believe that we like it and it's enjoyable and it's fun to argue about being Jewish with other Jews, and we're going to defeat the anti-Semites no matter what. And affiliation, yes.
Thanks very much. I'd like to just ask a couple of follow-up questions now. Let me start with you, Rabbi Joseph. When you talk about hope, optimism, I'm wondering how you would concretize that. Right. How should we inculcate this commitment to hope and to optimism? And as a kind of a secondary question, do you see the task of inculcating hope to be contrasted with what we also should be emphasizing, and that is some of the tragedies of Jewish history? Is it a matter of resilience, and how do we teach that resilience? Or is hope itself an independent value, independent of the tragedies of history? And how do we get that concretized in our congregational life?
And I'm sure everybody, I'm going to respond to Rabbi Klein seriously, but everybody understands that these are eternal questions, of course, so with lots of opinions in the room. I want to start in the concretization in saying that it has to be a stated, owned worldview. Our mission and vision statements of our institutions, formal, informal curricula in teaching, that hope is a trope that's always there. I don't know if it's as tacky as reminding people of the national anthem of Israel and singing Hatikva as a hope sign. It's interesting in a very positive way that that's the national anthem of Israel, right? The hope. So I think it has to be very intentional. I don't like teaching Judaism as a tragedy. There's, the joke, right? What's the Sunday school joke? What did you learn in Sunday school? The Egyptians had their tanks and their guns and their missiles, and we prevailed, let's eat, right? So I don't think that helps. We certainly have a good tradition in the Western world and probably in many other cultures of lifting up people that were able to overcome the adversities in their lives. I think those models are always helpful. But overall, Rabbi Klein, I think as we could do the curriculum, we could have the art shows and the program, all the projects about hopefulness. There has to be an overarching commitment to how do we create, how do we teach, and how do we participate in Jewish life and living for everybody all the time. And we all should be committed to create, teaching, and participating. I don't settle for people choosing one or two. I think people have to commit to being involved in all three.
You seem to be suggesting that the denser our Jewish life is, the more the commitment to hope will emerge.
So I'm guessing that will be the emergence. But what I think I know more than guess is that the density, or sociologists call it the thickness of the connections, will lead to at least an engagement in the conversations that I hope lead to hope. Because I can't test that. We can test for the engagement part of it. So if you're a home where Jewish, which is our identity, and Judaism, which is our religion, actually is part and parcel of what's happening in the home. Mail, if people still get snail mail, even advertising snail mail, has Jewish content. Things that happen on television and on DVRs and on your Hulu and your Roku TV and your phone and stuff have Jewish stuff. There's Jewish music all that thing that comes into the home and into the family conversations, that's always there.
I want to turn to Rabbi Lader just for a minute here. In your statement that many of us have read, you talk about cultivating a conscientious Jew. And I'm just wondering if you could describe a little bit what the profile of a conscientious Jew would be. What attributes would that person give evidence for? How do we create it?
I think that to be a conscientious Jew, you have to live in this world and see the world through a Jewish lens. And just like Rabbi Joseph was saying, I love the idea of a thick community where all aspects of your life are sort of grounded in this sense of community and who you are. And how many of you chose a career path or made a major life decision because of one mentor, somebody who said to you, I believe in you, you can do this, like you are good at this and this is who you are? And I think that so many of us make these major life choices. We follow paths. It could be a parent, it could be a teacher, a role model, a sibling, a friend who believes in what we're capable of. And I think that in terms of living a Jewish life and being a conscientious person, to have us say that to people, I believe in you, and this is your home, this is your foundation, this is who we are, shows them how to live a Jewish life through a Jewish lens. We create the foundation. We teach them, we sit around tables with them, we have discussions like Jews have. I took a group of kids this year to DC for a program called Litaken, where we lobby our congressmen and senators on Jewish causes, and or maybe it was a couple years ago, Carl Levin was still there. We were sitting around a table, and Carl Levin says to this group of adorable, 15-year-old kids, he says, you guys like floaters or sinkers? And they look at him, and he's like, come on, floaters or sinkers? It was like April. And some of them said, well, my family makes floaters. And he was like, ugh, mine were the sinkers, the ones that you have to cut with a knife. The matzo ball. It's matzo ball reference. And Senator Levin told this group of kids that because of the way his parents raised him, knocking door to door and talking about civic responsibility as a Jewish value, that every aspect of what he did in the United States Senate was grounded in Judaism. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg talks about the same thing. So I think that to create a conscientious Jew, it's intentional and unintentional. It's the way we talk. It's the way we listen to each other. It's what we do as families, as communities. It's how we treat people who look up to us. And so I don't think, like Julie said, there's not one way to create, not one right way to be Jewish, not one right fence to build, but for us to be mindful of the way we speak to people and the way we grow our thick community, I think is the only thing we can do.
Thank you so much. I want to ask a similar question to Rabbi Schwartz, if I can. In your statement, you make a distinction between outward identity markers, which I think you feel no longer work or should work, Jewish names, Jewish foods, signing an X on a box, but that we should be cultivating what you call intrinsically meaningful factors. So this is the question of identity. And of course, you have said there should be plural forms of Jewish identity, but I'm wondering what they would be for you. What would be some of those intrinsically, the things that we hold dear and to which we're committed, markers of Jewish identity?
Well, I do want to say that there is truth to the fact that if there are outward markers, behaviors, that it is more likely it's going to go inward. It's not an automatic. It's not, I eat matzo ball soup so I have the right values, or, gee, my family goes back 40 generations, but it doesn't mean anything to me. So one doesn't necessarily lead to the other, but it certainly helps to have all of those markers available. And yet, without the intrinsic values, it doesn't go anywhere. It means, from my perspective, it means nothing. And that sounds like a very harsh statement, but I think if we are talking about Jewish survival, being able to read Hebrew, as critical a skill as that is not of any use if it doesn't go anywhere, if it doesn't mean anything. Not even if that you don't have to understand the words you're reading, but you have to understand the why you're reading the words. And what does it mean to join together on Yom Kippur and talk about changing the way we live, taking responsibility, being accountable, taking our moral growth seriously. So if I can recite everything in that prayer book, but it doesn't go anywhere, that's a loser for me. I think we keep bringing them back. I don't say, oh, well, don't come back next year because, you didn't do a good job this year. I want those people in congregation with me too, especially because they sing loudly often and I need that help. But I think we have to talk about the way people live. And I think it's sometimes easier to speak from the negative than the positive, sadly. The way people do things that are harmful, that are hurtful, ugly, those are the things that I know should not be intrinsically Jewish. That doesn't mean Jews don't do them, where I do lots of awful things myself. I won't tell you any of them. But when I don't take that seriously, when I am not involved in the intentional growth and study and attempts to raise myself up, to move towards holiness of some sort, then it doesn't matter if I'm Jewish or if I take that term.
Mm-hmm. Inwardness, motivation, feeling are what are crucial from your point of view.
Commitment to growth of all sorts.
Yeah. Let me ask Rabbi Fox a question here. You talk about innovation anchored in tradition. I'm just wondering, I know this is a big question, but if you can present a couple of it, however they are tentative, some specifics here. What sort of innovations would you recommend? What do we need to do today to innovate and to keep our commitment fresh? And where specifically would you draw on tradition, not only to give some stability and continuity to what we're committed to, but also which have the potential for new innovations? What innovations, what traditions?
I think everything is up for innovation. That's who we are as Jews. It's that simple. A value is Shabbat. How we understand it is where the innovation takes place. I would say that I'm interested in half answering your question and half responding, because I think what we heard this morning is both innovation, creative, and anchored from the other three. And I think that one of the innovation is to learn to turn these things into questions, and I think things we just heard from the three of you are quite provocative potentially. The first thing is to think about letting go of the word congregation and think community only. We're sitting in a congregation. 25 to 20% of the members of the CCAR, the rabbinate of North America, serve in community-based settings, not in congregations. So how do we think about making someone Jewish authentically and creating that authentic experience? How do we think about understanding the fluidity of identity in our society? I think all these things we just heard about, how do we think about inspiring hope when we still have generations, and my parents are from Europe, so generations that are in some ways anchored in the Holocaust experience. So I think that the opportunity to do this is everywhere. The Yom HaShoah experience, we want to remember. We want to remember the destruction of the temple. Those are things that are an important part of who we are. We remember. The way we remember maybe don't create models of authenticity for the next generation that you talked about. They don't inspire hope. And for someone who wasn't raised Jewish, okay, how does that identify? How does that help them with their identity? Give one provocative example. It's taken me a long time to realize that lox, bagels, and cream cheese doesn't resonate in a Jewish crowd anymore when I speak somewhere. I understood exactly what you meant. I don't know if those kids did, okay? But when I ask people how many were raised with lox, bagels, and cream cheese, looking around this room, I'm going to guess most of us, okay? But I've been in many of a room where the people look at me and say, and I will tell you at the Hebrew Union College, we know this, even a lot of the rabbinic students weren't raised with lox, bagels, and cream cheese, or couldn't answer the question about the matzah balls, because they come from different family backgrounds. So in some ways, I think what we've heard here this morning can be turned into the kind of provocative questions we need to answer in order to innovate. How do we understand a Jewish community in North America that has a fluid identity, that had a parent who wasn't Jewish or multiple parents? One of my friends talks about his grandmother, great-great-grandmother, who got off on the Mayflower all the time. That's part of his identity as a Jew. Okay? That's part of his identity. When I use Yiddish words from my dad's side, not my mom's, the German side, okay, people look at me like, what? Okay. We are, I think, what you were talking about is identity. We've seen articles about living in a post-ethnic Judaism. Post-ethnic Judaism. So how do you innovate? Do we do it with the food and the culture, the things we had this morning? And how do we do that and create the kind of hope? I think the best answer we heard this morning is the answer I believe in, which is really anchored in education and experience. And we have somebody in this panel who's led the way in helping rabbis rethink education. I mean, that's what you've done in your classes for generation. Rabbi Joseph, I've been in some of those classes and sit in when he challenges the rabbis to rethink what is Jewish education. So I think it's hard to answer your question. When I can go through and answer it, I'll say the last answer for me is my generation needs to learn not to answer the question. My generation needs to learn how to ask the question to lead to that answer. I believe for rabbis and others in what I call reverse responsa. Response is where a community asks the rabbi the question and we, the authority, give you the answer. Okay? I believe in reverse responsa. I think we, the rabbinic leaders, need to learn to ask the next generation the right question that will help them and us together lead to answer your question.
Well, I think that's a very provocative response. Here's how I understand what you're saying. There are some millennial topics in Judaism: Shabbat, community, suffering, Holocaust. And these are the realities, so to speak, that transcend the generations, but that we need to take those topics and not just accept the answers that have hitherto been given, but to refresh the meaning of those topics for today. After all, we want the innovations to be Jewish innovations, which means we have to really begin with a set of ideas, content that is Jewish, but open-ended enough to be able to be flexible.
If you look at the prayer book today, the Machzor, or some of the new innovations in liturgy, it's not calling up a boy or a girl for bar or bat mitzvah. There's also recognition of what you were talking about, the fluidity, identity, authenticity. There's an opportunity for someone who's part of the LGBTQ community to be called up. We're still calling them up to Torah, but we're recognizing the fluidity of identity. We're recognizing the opportunity to give them hope for the future. And importantly, to be in relationship. So everything can be answered in sort of a unique way. In our house in Shabbat in Los Angeles, I live 2 blocks from my sister, the kids had to be home for dinner, for Shabbat dinner, and then they could leave. Okay? That certainly wouldn't have been a generation or two earlier. Was that an innovation? Yeah, I sort of think so. And a recognition of a different sense of identity and culture.
Yeah, Sam?
I mean, so we'll now move. I mean, we're getting deeper and deeper, which we should. So in 2019, we're trying to understand what is a Jewish religious community that's not Orthodox. What is a Jewish religious community that's not Orthodox? What does it mean? I mean, our forebearers that were reformers, whether either they were Orthodox or nothing, right? It's the old story of in Israel. I'm secular Israeli. The synagogue I stay away from is an Orthodox synagogue. The whole issue of authority and autonomy, in a secular world, and I believe that one of the things that for us in a secular world, I think it's so certain those of us in the room, and if we want to talk about the early 20s to the early 30s millennial crowd, all of us are trying to understand alienation. What's my existential angst as I try to make my way through the world? And if you're in your 20s, what do I see ahead? I mean, a lot of people in that age group get their news from Colbert, but if you watch other news and if you read some sort of blog or something digitally or in print that's the news, it can be very despairing. And can we have a community where there's no religious response? See, what's it mean to be a quote? We can't answer it this morning, really, but what's it mean to be a religious Reformed Jew? What's it mean? We don't have a religious community. Why should somebody come to a congregation? They can get this at other places. We generally can't compete with the coffee. Most synagogue coffee is terrible, right? We can't compete with the popular culture. The mega churches, right? I'm sure in Cleveland there's a church that gets 10 to 15,000 people every Saturday and Sunday. What they do is they've created so that the boundaries of coming into the church from the outside world are infinitely permeable. So we are all overdressed for a worship service there because most of us don't dress up like this at work unless we're in court or something fancy. We're also, the age demographic are hugely millennials. The seating is unbelievably comfortable. They have fabulous coffee that you can bring into the service. People are like, oh my God. And it's good coffee. Great Wi-Fi. Services are 1 hour punct. Lighting is Broadway lighting. You should go. Do a secret shopper visit. I'm serious. Go once. Go once and see it. The lighting is Broadway. The sound system is Broadway. Most sound systems in synagogues are like something returned to Radio Shack before it went bankrupt. There are people that have more expensive earbuds in their ears than the sound system in many synagogues that I visit. So when people come in for that hour, they're engaged. It's not like disjointed from what happens in my daily life on the street. So they come in, we have them in it, and then the pastor gives a message about that life is worth living, through their theology. And then they have they don't call them havarot because they don't know Hebrew, but they have home study groups that, how is Jesus walking in the street, etc. So I'm saying, I think we have to think about where do people get a chance to address in community how I'm going to live this life, and why I don't think it's, as Ecclesiastes says, it's in vain, that life is not in vain, that there's a purpose to be here. And I think that that's a big for us. That was my High Holy Day sermon.
Let me ask the question, if I can, in another way. We've been talking about culture. You've mentioned all kinds of opportunities that we have today to engage with one another. I've always felt that the one institution of Jewish life that seeks transcendence, that touches us with the permanent values and realities, is the synagogue. So how should we be bringing transcendence into the lives of our congregants? Or to put it differently, is belief in God, however one understands it, crucial for a vibrant, vital, continuous Jewish life?
So personally, I would disagree that the synagogue is the home of transcendence. For me, for many people that I know, for my generation, transcendence happens at summer camp. Transcendence happens, right? How many of you, your kids, came home from summer camp different people, or you did? Right, sitting with their friends, arm in arm, watching the sunrise on a mountain, singing together. I mean, that's a different kind of transcendence than you're going to get from synagogue pews. Youth group is the same, right? People find themselves, and they have moments of transcendence that don't feel forced. It feels different when you're out there. People feel transcendent when they're hiking. The adventure rabbis doing amazing things, doing bar mitzvahs at the top of mountains in Colorado. And so I think that to limit that idea of transcendence, of godliness, of connection to the divine, to a building challenges the very nature of Rabbi Fox's statement that we're no longer going to be solidly an institutional faith, that now in today's age, we're gonna give and take transcendence wherever we can take it, wherever we can find it. And so to be limited to a building is challenging. However, it doesn't mean that the legacy congregations, or whatever you're gonna call them, aren't valuable. I certainly work for one. And it's an amazing place where transcendent moments happen for lots and lots of people. But I don't want us to feel limited by believing that you have to, pay your dues and come every week and in order to connect to something greater than yourself.
Let me challenge you on that for a minute. Is the synagogue conceding its purposes to camps, to hikes, to things that go on outside the institution? I mean, after all, one of the strengths of institutions is continuity, and that they build foundations. I'm just wondering whether some of the activities to which you're referring aren't a bit more episodic in nature, and are they likely to build the foundations that can be durable enough in the way in which the synagogue can? Or to rephrase it, should the synagogue learn from some of these non-institutional and bring what we've learned back into the synagogue to strengthen the synagogue?
So I'm a Hebrew school dropout. I dropped out of Hebrew school. I was a terrible student. I got in trouble all the time. I spent more time in the principal's office than I did in a chair in the Hebrew school classroom. And many of my fellow classmates were the same. We had our transcendent moments. They're not meant to be. It's not. We're not reaching enlightenment as a Jewish community when we sit in a pew of a synagogue or when we go to summer camp. We're not looking for an extended connection with the spiritual and divine. We are looking for transcendent moments that make us realize the value of a Jewish community. And so for me, for sure it was camp, realizing the value of Jewish learning. I remember writing my rabbi a mean letter from camp saying, "You never made me feel like this." And I said, "I think you're going to be a rabbi," and now we're good friends. But I don't think it's about, I think it's about making sure that at some point in people's lives, they feel what that feels like in order to understand the value of what we're trying to accomplish as a people. Because if you don't have those moments, some people are never going to have them in a building, then we're lost, then we have no future.
And should the synagogue be taking very seriously the possibility of those moments and, maybe to use an infelicitous phrase, institutionalize them?
So that's my whole life. That's what I try to do personally, and I think many rabbis are trying to do and are doing very well. to take these moments and be there with our congregants when they have them, so that when they come back from these moments, you go on a vacation and you really feel great, and you come back and there's no vacation anymore and you don't feel that good anymore. But if you go on vacation and you come back and the people you've connected with and the person who led the hike in the wilderness, I'm using hikes a lot, I don't even like hiking that much. But it's building that community that then you can come back and be a part of, and you don't have to be on vacation to feel the joy you felt when you were with your best friend or with your partner or with your child. It's that, Havdalah, we try to, we say these blessings to separate the sacred from the profane, the ordinary from the special. But the whole goal of Havdalah is to take some of that special feeling, that feeling of difference, of rest, of renewal, of spirituality, and weave it into the ordinary so that our ordinary moments become sacred moments. And I think that's the goal of these transcendent moments, is to take that transcendence and carry even a spark of it with you, with the hope that we'll feel it again and again and again in different situations, at a service, with a sermon, at a program, at summer camp, when you send your kid to summer camp, that those are also transcendent moments, and you're not going to have any more of them, any more of that special spark, unless you're here.
And it seems as if the synagogue has the goal of trying to take those remarkable moments, those experiences, and find a way to bring them into the synagogue creatively. Other comments, Julie?
I think the issue is that we can't be defensive as synagogues. We can't say, oh, well, that will hurt us in some way, or we have to do it better than. I'm very much a supporter of the future of synagogues. I think the institutions are critical. But it's how we get people into the institutions that have to be more welcoming, and not by a nice person at the door, but by someone saying, what you do is Jewish, come join us, let's see what you have to teach us, let's see what we can teach you, what we can learn together. The issue is not finding Jewish things to do and saying that goes in the yes category and that goes in the no category. It's looking at everything and saying, how could this be part of what we consider Judaism? There are things we've never done before that could be Jewish. And there are things that no longer are Jewish and always were. We think about the changes the reformers made. It was to make some things no longer Jewish.
One of the great challenges I think that we face in this room, because we're all anchored to synagogue life. So one of the great challenges we have to face is how we are going to invest in some of the innovation and creativity and touch points outside of our walls to connect those people back. So if I know communities, I know a little about Cleveland, I know a lot about Los Angeles, I know other communities, I don't know your population, but there's a part of Los Angeles, the entire west side, which probably has more Jews than you can imagine, with something like a 13% affiliation rate. So how are some of the synagogues that might have resources going to invest in planting a rabbi, an educator, an organizer in that place?
A facilitator.
A facilitator, whatever word we want to use, and not say, oh, they're out of our building, but rather we're planting the person there who is ultimately going to connect that population back to us.
And that I want to add to the challenge is that how we in this room define community is up for discussion. Right? When I have young people, like Rabbi Lader deals with, talk about virtual community, it sounds like an oxymoron to me. How can there be a virtual community? But people have some very powerful communities that are virtual, that are online. And I want to return, not to beat it all the time, this authority and autonomy piece. So as a boomer, basically I inherited from my parents and grandparents a certain set of values and commitments and responsibilities. The one thing I see, and I'm a bit envious of it, and I try to emulate a little of it, but it's hard as an old guy, is that the millennials curate their lives. So, like, I still have cable, but millennials don't have cable, right? They curate their TV, so they watch whatever, the same shows, but they watch it when they want to watch it. They get rid of the cable. They have all the different ways to just choose what I want to choose. Parenthetically, Cincinnati has a small multinational company called Procter Gamble, and they're the largest advertiser in the world, and they're freaking out because nobody watches advertising anymore. They know print advertising is already a disaster, because who reads newspapers? But what do you do for television advertising? They invented the soap opera, right, to sell ivory soap. So anyway, but they curate music. How many of us already are curating our music? Right? We make a playlist. We only listen to the radio basically in your car because you're bored, and if you're good, you don't even do that because you have your playlist in the car. You may have a Bose on your counter in the kitchen, but you don't know how to set the clock, so it's always blinking on the Bose. People are, everything in their lives are curated because we have the autonomy to do that. So what is it that holds us together? Right? That's really such the important question. Can we come together because we have something or things that will make our lives richer? And to say that being Jewish is rich and meaningful and fulfilling, and it helps us put a foot out of the bed and one foot in front of the other during the day. And that's why we come together. Not the edifices. I mean, we could ask, look, our people did pretty well with a portable tent in the wilderness to pray. I mean, eventually they got to Jerusalem and built this big edifice. And they're playing millennium. Look, we have the food trucks. There's lots of pop-up religious stuff out there. In the Christian world, we know, but in the Jewish world, there are pop-up synagogues going on in cities. I don't know if it's happening in Cleveland. Pop-up High Holy Days going on. All kinds of pop-up Shabbat and that kind of thing.
Sam, excuse me for interrupting you. I want to be sure to get to a question or two from you out in the audience. Perhaps there are other questions that have been written. One person asks, should a Jew know something about modern Israeli history?
This connects to the comment I would make that I think ties our radical answers to normative Judaism, which is there has to be depth in what we do. It isn't about doing something that's merely attractive. It's not about just going on a really cool hike. There has to be a depth that makes that hike connect to something bigger and more important. And it can't be pablum. It can't be stuff that I can make up, as I'm taking the first steps out of my car.
So you're talking about content.
Content.
What should it be?
Well, let's go to your question, which is about modern Jewish history or Israeli history. First of all, I'm not so sure I could teach that course. I don't know that any of us can teach a course moves that fast these days. But we can share from our experiences. We can tell folks our understanding, and then we have to also accept the very modern notion that there's no such thing as history anyway. That our views of the past are just that, views of the past, one perspective. We have to give up these absolutes. I was a history major. This is the most upsetting idea in the world. And yet, when we're honest, we accept some amount of truth to it, that the objective past, there is no such thing.
Yes, but is objectivity the goal, or what I might call a usable past?
Well,
the creation of a coherent story that has elements and that has persuasive capacity.
Well, as long as you use the word story. Mm-hmm. Right? Because that's different than fact.
Well, what should be the elements of our story?
Well, now are we on Israel or any story at all, right? But let's just, one more time there, because this is important to me. It's recognizing that it's story. No one holds truth all by themselves. And that makes us much more scared and nimble and keeps us humble as well.
And in order to do that, I loved what you wrote, okay? Which is, I would say, in order to do that and answer that question, I think you said, don't make the deal, is what you wrote. Education, education, education. That was your essay. Mm-hmm. Don't make the deal. It's okay, you can skip religious school to go to soccer. Our obligation is to ensure that religious school isn't just the passing of information, but it is what we've called this morning modeling and creating that authentic experience. So there's mutuality in this room. Don't make the deal. Read that essay if you haven't done it. Because how many of us, or our children for our grandchildren or whatever, are making that deal? So that also ties into where modern Jewish history is taught, where Israel history is taught. If you can create it in a 2-week intensive experience, that you experience it at camp, you can learn, but it doesn't really create the community when you get home. So I think the answer is content and experience. And don't make that deal. Don't say, Shabbat's not important, go play soccer, go do this, go do this, go do this.
Well, we've been talking a great deal about, go ahead.
I just want to say, or make the deal, but make a second deal along with it. You don't go to Hebrew school. And I say this, and if I had congregants, former congregants here, they would come after me with all the things I did and to not agree with that. Don't come to Hebrew school. Let's find another way of doing this. There is nothing that makes going to Hebrew school a godly given activity. It's an efficient way to teach some children.
But don't you think that we risk giving weight to the experience, which in some sense is fleeting, and not to a content, the content of the story we tell, and that has sustained us for millennia? Whether or not it's the absolute truth or it's the only truth, I'm not interested in that. But what are the elements of our story that need to be inculcated so the experiences are richer and more durable?
I think there are things that we need to learn together or study together. I wouldn't say there's not content that should be passed from generation to generation, but the how you pass it and the why you pass it. I don't expect the things I pass to my children to be lived out in any way that I've lived them out.
You know, Moses gets the Torah on Sinai perfectly, and we have thousands of years of commentary trying to understand it. I mean, why? You know, and we talk about the Plout commentary that we have probably in the main sanctuary here. I think we should join ourselves to the story, and we can disagree with the story. To me, the bigger thing is I would like to sit with curriculum writers and teachers on how do we help our young people and adults think about this issue. What are the questions they should be asking? How do other people address those? With which do you disagree and why? I want to be part of that discussion and that debate in a literate way. And I think that's the blessing, of course, of also being in a liberal tradition. If we're in a conservative tradition or Orthodox tradition, small c, small o, there's a right answer. But if we say that we're in a liberal tradition, then we have to be literally part of the debate.
I've just been handed the scariest word in my vocabulary, end it. And I've always tried to ignore that sign, but we're on a schedule. So join me in thanking our wonderful panelists. It's been a very, very rich conversation. We will be continuing it here in our congregation, and we hope in many congregations.